In case you're wondering, I still have plenty to say about the poor in media.
Shall we continue to build palace after palace for the rich? Or shall we aspire to a more noble purpose and build decent housing for the poor? How does the Senate vote? Fuck the poor! Good.
As long as the sentiment to place the majority of the blame on individuals instead of the existing system structure, I'll keep making this type of content. Feel free to like, subscribe, whatever. Just don't be a dirty alpaca in the comments. We all know that alpacas are bad animals because they have a bad temperament and they're terrible. They're terrible. We all know this. And we all know that llamas are better. They're just better. One of the first things I noticed when researching this topic is that there are many resources about how to budget, make your money work for you, or how to spend less. Some are free, others require payment. On occasion, you might be able to see a snippet before they require payment. And of course, some are just outright scams. While budgeting does require understanding the resources that we have at our disposal, for the poor, budgeting is only a small part of the issues with our daily life, and many already budget. And looking at several sources, there's a common sentiment that it's almost a surprise that the poor spend the majority of their income on basic necessities. We may not call it budgeting per se, but this certainly isn't new information for those struggling to survive on low wages.
I mean, it's one banana, Michael. What could it cost? $10?
You've never actually set foot in a supermarket, have you?
I don't have time for that.
In the 2012 NPR article linked below, quote, "Poor families spend a much larger share of their budget on basic necessities such as food at home, utilities, and healthcare. Rich families are able to devote a much bigger chunk of their spending to education and a much bigger share to saving for retirement. The retirement line includes contributions to Social Security and private retirement plans, by the way," end quote. As far as that last sentence about the affluence contribution, I think the Boondocks pretty much sums up why the poor won't have to worry about retirement anyways.
What's that box for?
It's my soapbox. If you have important things to say, you use a soapbox. Sir, would you like to hear about how the government wants you dead by 62 so you can't collect on Social Security?
Is that true?
Yes, but lemon juice can lead to a longer, healthier life.
Oh, I'll take a cup.
There are numerous articles and blogs out there about how to save money, and one of the most common points is budgeting. The thought is that the reason people are unable to save is that they're not spending it properly as they see it, and they're just wasting their money on frivolous things or avocado toast. If only the poor could budget, then surely they would solve many of their problems, right? It couldn't possibly be the high cost of living and low wages, could it? In some cases, I don't think the researchers actually talked to poor people. If they did, they didn't pick up on nuance. Also, as I've mentioned in other videos, they asked the wrong questions. One glaring example of this is the USDA's article, "Are Lower Income Households Willing and Able to Budget for Fruits and Vegetables?" Quote, "Not only do households spend less on fruits and vegetables if their income is below 130% of the poverty line, but it also found that low-income households are unlikely to increase fruit and vegetable spending given an extra dollar of income," end quote. The study used the Engel model and focused on income but excluded a crucial consideration, the cost of food. The variables are listed in Appendix Table 1, none of which are food costs. This came out in 2008, and it usually takes 1 to 2 years to gather and analyze these data. Even if we consider going all the way back to 2000, it's insulting to assume that an increase of $1 will significantly change spending habits. It's also misleading to continue to describe a dollar increase as a small increase in income throughout the article, considering they don't clarify if that means a dollar increase per month, dollar increase per week, or dollar increase in hourly wages. When given more funds for food, the low-income participants allotted this more towards meat and frozen prepared foods, which makes sense. If the researchers had asked the right questions or truly understood the responses, they might have figured out that it's due to practicality. Meat has protein and is more filling, and frozen prepared foods have a longer shelf life. Even in the article, quote, "Low-income Black women living in urban public housing projects stated that many fruits and vegetables were not as economical as other foods. Some respondents valued grapes and apples for their taste, considered potatoes and other starches better for filling up the family," end quote. The participants told them why they didn't spend their dollar on fruit and veg as often, because for the poor, it's a luxury. So how much of an increase resulted in lower income households spending more on fruits and veg? A 10% increase. In this study, 4-person households with an income of $24,258 or less was considered a low income. A 10% increase would be $2,425.80 a year, or $202.15 a month. Imagine what your household could do with an extra $200 for food.
Eat that. That's 30 cents worth of oatmeal.
My father always knew what everything costs.
That's $1.09 in the trash.
Access to quality food and transportation needs are a series of videos on its own, but for this video I want to focus on how low-income families budget by looking at economic value and practicality. Sure, fresh produce is healthy, but the cost of different types of food greatly impacts where money is spent. You know, something that study didn't account for. But if we look at shows like Everybody Hates Chris, the dad Julian is mentally calculating every food in the house. It may not be budgeting in the traditional sense, but how many high-income households know how much a bowl of oatmeal or chicken wing costs and tabulates it into their budget? When it comes to low-income households, the economic cost of a type of food is going to overshadow whether or not it's healthy. $5 on ramen noodles is going to go much further than $5 on apples. I checked the price at local grocery stores near me, and depending on the brand, ramen is between 19 to 29 cents a package. If we calculated about 25 cents a package, $5 would roughly buy about 20 packages, whereas with apples at about $1.30 a pound, it'll buy about 4 pounds or roughly 10 to 12 apples depending on the size. The ramen is a much more economical choice as the shelf life is much longer, it has more calories, and it's more filling. The other thing from Julian's character I want to point out is that he is constantly aware of the cost and budget at all times. It isn't only when they're shopping or tabulating their monthly budget. The poor are usually pretty aware of where every cent is going the majority of the time.
Okay. First we send in the phone bill and we forget to sign the check.
There you go.
Then we send the water bill to the electric company, electric bill to the water company.
Now you're cooking.
And you know that charge card bill, it never even showed up.
This type of constant mental budgeting also feeds into daily costs such as transportation, utilities, and other bills. I've previously made videos on transportation and I'll link those here. Recently there was a TikTok where a young creator suggested using scooters to get around instead of cars since the price of gas went up. On the surface that sounds nice, but in reality it's ill-informed and ignorant of the transportation needs for people in the United States. For those in areas with decent public transportation and usable sidewalks, unless the costs go up, it's not going to impact them as much. However, a large portion of the US population does not live in an area with safe and reliable public transportation, so a vehicle is almost a necessity. A household already struggling on a tight budget will now have to move funds around to account for the extra money for gas and likely take it out of another part of their budget, such as food or utilities. Not to mention this heavily impacts farmers and small businesses, and in turn the cost of food. You know, that variable that was left out of that article? Moving money around from one bill to another accrues costs. In most cases, if a household needs to skip a bill, it's more likely to be a utility versus rent. Turning the water back on is going to be less stress and money than having to find a new place to live. In the 2016 article, High Utility Costs Force Hard Decisions for the Poor, the struggle to pay utility bills affects the poor the most. Participants in the article explained that even with keeping appliances unplugged and lights off, the electricity bill was still too high to pay. This doesn't even account for those who don't have a bank account and therefore have to go to a physical location to pay their bill in cash or have to pay for money order in cases where cash is not accepted. $1.50 may not sound like a lot, but if you have 4 bills to pay, that's $6. Also, more places are now only allowing 2 money orders per month before the cost is higher, and it could end up being about $10 a month. These are all costs that need to be included in a budget along with the transportation and time to be able to do this. While there is assistance to low-income households, the gap between how much help is available and the cost is wide across the board. For the family in the 2016 article, the winter utility cost was 15% of their income and, quote, more than twice what economists like Roger Colton consider sustainable. She chose to pay a medical bill for her cancer treatment ahead of the $470 she owed her utility, end quote.
Who is this?
It's Mr. Applegate, sir. He's here to speak to you about his
mortgage.
Please, Mr. Scrooge, I know you're very angry about this, and I didn't mean to fall behind in the payments. Lord knows it being Christmas and all. Oh, please don't shout at me, sir. I mean, you can yell and scream, and you're right, but it won't do no good, because I'm the stone you can't squeeze blood from, and that's the truth. Thank you for not shouting at me.
Difficulty paying bills is usually occurring at the same time as other issues. If a household is late on a bill, there are penalties and late fees that add to the amount due. So in getting caught up on the water bill, the electricity bill grows. The next month, the electricity bill is paid, or at least paid enough to keep it turned on, and the water bill then accrues late fees and penalties. If the electricity bill was not paid in full, some companies charge penalties for carrying a balance. As a result, the poor end up paying more for utilities than higher income households. This precarious situation leaves the poor in a position where borrowing money or payday loans can seem like a way out. Payday loans is another topic on its own. States such as Minnesota have policies like the cold weather rule, quote, "If you can prove to your utility company that you are making less than half of the median income in Minnesota, they cannot shut off any utility that you use to provide heat," end quote. This is in place from October 1st to April 30th, and it's not an automatic rule. You have to provide documentation for this and work out a payment plan with the utility company. Also, this doesn't mean that your balance disappears. It just means that they cannot shut off your utilities during this time period as long as you are making payments according to the payment plan. It's also a contributing factor to households needing to declare bankruptcy.
What do you mean fired? You can't fire me for this!
Sorry, store policy is very clear about stealing.
But he didn't steal it. He returned it. It's right there. The bottle is perfect. You can just put it right back on the shelf.
I already marked it out of inventory. My hands are tied here.
What are you talking about? You don't even do inventory. You foist it off on me because you make so many mistakes.
In the Netflix show Maid, Alex is constantly tallying up the cost of transportation, gas, utilities, bills. It's always looming. This constant stress wears a person down. Then factor in poor chaos. What does this mean? For this video, poor chaos is when factors that can or cannot be controlled impact the positive steps that have been taken to escape poverty. Alex manages to get affordable housing in an affluent area for her daughter to attend a quality daycare. She then tries to have a small birthday party for her daughter that her ex attends along with his guests and her friends that have a total disregard for the property. Alex tries to keep them calm and prevent them from destroying the property throughout the evening, but unfortunately it doesn't work out that way. There is a sizable mess and damage to the property that she has to clean up, and as a result, Alex loses the property and has to look again. According to the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, quote, "Housing is the key to reducing intergenerational poverty and increasing economic mobility," end quote. Throughout Maid, Alex has many struggles and housing is one of them. After she is out of the women's shelter, she is given a chance to live in an apartment that has black mold, and it affects her daughter's health, which results in costly doctor visits and days where she cannot attend daycare. These are factors that affect Alex's ability to save any money, and as both affect her budget, because missing work means losing income. For many low-income households, the struggle for basic necessities is constant, as I've mentioned throughout this video. And advice from people like Dave Ramsey with financial tips like paying off credit cards or earning money are not exactly helpful. In Malcolm in the Middle, when Lois loses her job, earning more money isn't solving the situation. She needs her job back or a new job. In Maid, Alex is struggling to find consistent income, period. Also, the advice to just pay off credit cards doesn't account for the fact that many low-income households do not have a credit card or even qualify for a credit card. In Shameless, the family relies heavily on cash, and none of them have a credit card until much later, and from what I can tell, none of them have a bank account. In 2020, 79% of consumers had at least one credit card in the US. Of those, 82% had prime credit scores of 750 or higher. Only 64% of households that made less than $25,000 annually even have a credit card, and families that are Black or Hispanic are also less likely to have one. So the credit card advice isn't universally applicable.
Hey, you lost your money fair and square. I didn't scam nobody.
Be honest with me. Is it actually possible to win this game?
If I like it, it is.
Hot dog, let's go!
In Dave Ramsey's Total Money Makeover, he explains that an emergency fund is a necessity. While I don't disagree, just tightening your budget for a year and cutting down on costs is a bit simplistic and assumes nothing will go wrong for that time period to disrupt this process. His writing heavily emphasizes eliminating debt and avoiding bankruptcy. Again, not necessarily bad, but doesn't account for what life can throw at you. Bankruptcy is not fun to go through, but it is not the worst thing that can happen. There are cases in which declaring bankruptcy to take care of medical debts may be the only realistic solution. Also, bankruptcy costs money, and low-income households may not even be able to afford to do so. According to the 2022 article by Investopedia, the number one reason for bankruptcy filings is medical expenses and accounts for about 66% of bankruptcy filings. The next most common is job loss. Poor or excessive use of credit is only the third most common reason. The fact that over half of those declaring bankruptcy due to medical expenses says more about the healthcare system in the US rather than our ability to budget. I worked at a bankruptcy office for about 3 years and can attest to the fact that the majority of filings were related to medical expenses or depletion of savings due to job loss or divorce. It was pretty rare to see cases due to credit cards and excessive spending. I'm sure there are those who have benefited from using these financial gurus, but in reality, low-income households are far more aware of where their funds are going than the rich are. In the 2016 article from the Washington Post, quote, "Conservative experts on poverty often argue that it is a result of personal failings and bad choices, including financial choice on the part of the poor. The liberal counter-argument is typically that poverty itself causes intense stress that impairs sound decision-making," end quote. Also, later in the article, it points out that, quote, "The affluent are slightly more susceptible to misleading comparative perceptions of price," end quote. When Lois loses her job, the family has to tighten their budget now that they are a one-income household instead of two. It's not guaranteed that Lois will be able to find another job quickly. Even filing for unemployment doesn't guarantee you'll receive it, or even receive it in a timely manner. So let's create a budget. Let's say random citizen 8542721 makes $25,000 a year with an hourly wage of $12. This would be gross income. After taxes, which is about 20% depending on the state, that leaves roughly $20,000 a year. Taxes in my state are roughly 30%, so I'm actually aiming low here. With $20,000 a year, that's about $1,667 per month. Rent for a studio or one-bedroom apartment in my state and surrounding states is roughly $900 to $1,100 a month, so we'll say $1,000 for rent. So right off the bat, the household is down to $667 to cover food, transportation, utilities, medical expenses, school fees, repairs, insurance, and medication. We'll assume that citizen 8542721 is in good health and without any disability, and doesn't need pesky things like medication or durable medical equipment. As far as utilities in my condo, the water and sewage are part of rent, which means I have to cover the cost of electricity and gas. If it is a cold month, my gas bill can be as high as $200. For this video, we'll just use $200 as an example for utilities, which again, low. When that is accounted for in the budget, that leaves $467 for the month, or roughly about $116 a week to cover any other expenses. It's tough, but doable. You can't live lavishly, but you also have to hope that nothing major happens. What about the 2021 electricity crisis in Texas, where some households saw $1,000 or more for their heat bill? An unforeseen anomaly in weather drove up utilities, and much of the housing in Texas, especially for low income, is poorly insulated. People in the South are more prepared for temperatures above 100, as this is a yearly inevitability, whereas freezing temperatures are far less common. It makes more sense to prepare for heat waves and blizzards, not to mention other issues such as freezing pipes and blackouts. In Minnesota, preparing for cold temperatures makes more sense as the probability of a heat wave is quite low, and many homes can function without air conditioning, or at least can get by with a window unit or two. Citizen 8542721 could try to find cheaper housing, which usually means less safety and more health risks like black mold. They could also try to find another job, which means making sure they have transportation to do so, as well as figuring out a time to try and fit in an interview. If they do manage to get a job and it's working from home, the cost of internet needs to be considered. If internet is not already part of the rent, then there is the cost to install and set up internet that has to be added into the budget. I could go further into more aspects of this, but hopefully this illustrates how problems snowball into difficult situations that continually build and make it near impossible to escape poverty. Budgeting is a necessity for those in poverty, but it's not the solution. It's the lack of resources and high cost of living that hurt the chances of escaping poverty, not figuring out where we spend our money. For many, rent and mortgage take up so much of our income, there isn't much left over to try and live on. Affordable housing would be a step in the right direction. While we may be able to control some of the factors in our lives, we can't control all of them. At the end of the day, most low-income households don't need lessons on how to budget. They need help with access to resources and affordable housing. Till next time.
Syrups, powders, whipped cream is right here. You ever worked with one of these?
I think I can handle it. I went to Wharton.
Well, I went to Harvard.
And I went to Juvie. And we're all here wearing an apron.